Hi there, I'm Scotty. I'm a practicing witch, a professional tarot nerd, and today I'm a storyteller. And I'm so glad you're here. This is part one of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, abridged and adapted after a fashion by me. This novella was first published on December 19th, 1843. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt at all about that. 7 years had slithered by since the day Marley had died. Scrooge had never painted out old Marley's name from above the office door. Scrooge and Marley, it said. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Scrooge was a hard man, hard and sharp with not a single soft or gentle edge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old man was Scrooge. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. That same cold within him came out white in his wispy hair, his bushy eyebrows, and upon his wiry chin. Once upon a time, Christmas Eve no less, Scrooge sat busy in his office. It was a day of biting cold and bitter weather. The door to Scrooge's office was open so that he could keep an eye on his only employee working quietly in the office beyond. Miser that he was, Scrooge allowed only a small fire to warm the place, and his poor clerk sat bundled within a blanket and warmed his hands now and then with the lone candle that he was allowed to light his work. The door to the street opened suddenly, and in came a man, ruddy of complexion from the cold, but handsome of face and sparkling of eye. He was followed all about him with the cold breezes of the day, and a small cloud of snowflakes fluttering all around him like a wintry halo. "Merry Christmas, Uncle!" the man exclaimed cheerfully. "Bah, humbug!" replied Scrooge. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned his nephew brightly, "what right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said "Bah!" again, and followed it up with a humbug. "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "Nephew," returned the uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your way, and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it," repeated Scrooge's nephew, "but you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone, then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas among the rest, but I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, as a good time. A kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good. It's a time to be generous and gracious, Uncle. There are many whom are in need of simple necessities." "Are there no shelters? Are there no food banks?" asked Scrooge. "There are, Uncle." "Oh, good. I was afraid, from what you had said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." "But, Uncle, there are so few and the needy so many." "Humbug!" exclaimed Scrooge. "I pay my taxes, and that is enough." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge wasn't angry, no more angry with anything than he ever was, as a matter of course. "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge, changing the subject. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love?" growled Scrooge, as if that were the only one thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we dine together as family?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute, but I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon." His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. As the day progressed, the weather grew colder and more bitter, as though it were trying to keep pace with Scrooge's old implacable heart. Outside the window of the office, a boy passing by in the cold stopped suddenly to regale Scrooge with a Christmas carol. His face was reddened by the chill air, and snowflakes clung all about his cap and his shoulders. But at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized a ruler from his desk with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the window to the fog and even more congenial frost. At last, closing time arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop $1 for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his blanket dangling below his waist, for he had no greatcoat, went down the slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blindsman Bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening away with his banker's book, he went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in an old building, old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge. The walk home was brief enough, yet Scrooge grumbled to himself all the same as merrymakers scurried about on last-minute errands in the chill evening. "Merry Christmas!" cried a young man passing by as Scrooge mounted the few steps to his door. "Humbug!" Scrooge replied as he slid his key into the lock. There, in the glass of the door, dingy and grime-covered, he could make out, ever so dimly, a reflection of himself. He'd seen this sight so often that he hardly took note of it. But this night he did take note, and this night the reflection looked back and was the face not of Scrooge, but was that of Marley. Marley dead these 7 years. Marley's face. It had a dismal light about it, faintly glowing. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That in its livid color made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than as a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was again his own reflection. To say that he was not startled would be untrue, but he turned his key, thrust open the door, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it at first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's face once again on the glass. But there was nothing on the back of the door except what Scrooge would expect to see, his own reflection in the glass. So he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Quite satisfied, he closed the door and locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. And thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. Scrooge sat before the pitiful flame, drowsy from the day. The flame danced at first, as any flame should, when without preamble or fanfare, the flame took on the shape and visage of old dead Marley, looking as he had before in the glass of the door. Startled, Scrooge stood and stared as the flame once again was a flame. "Humbug," said Scrooge as he walked across the room. After several turns he sat down again, and his gaze fell upon an old clock hanging on the wall, a clock which Scrooge had rarely noted since he had moved into Marley's room all those years ago. The clock had been untouched, and had not once ticked or tocked or chimed since it had unwound many years ago. But now, as he looked, he saw the pendulum begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound. But soon it began to tick and tock, as any good clock should. And shortly thereafter it rang out loudly, striking the late hour. With each chime louder than those before, it wasn't long before Scrooge had to cover his ears with his cold and trembling hands. Old Scrooge was relieved after the 12th chime, and he lowered his hands from his ears, only to hear one last chime, a 13th chime, loudest of all. The echoes of that chime sounded throughout the old and empty house, lingering longer than Scrooge thought they should, but after a time the house was silent again. As his heart pounded, Scrooge said to no one, "Humbug!" and this seemed to calm him. Then, from deep down below, He heard a clanking noise, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain about a cluttered room. He heard the sound of the basement door fly open with a booming sound, and then he heard the rattles of the chains, much louder from the floor below, and then coming up the stairs, and then coming towards his bedroom door.
"It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it."
His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, and Scrooge could see the face of his visitor. The same face, the very same Marley in his usual waistcoat, pants, and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his beard, and his coat skirts and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the wall behind. He looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its empty, cold eyes, and saw the chains wrapped all about and trailing behind. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses.
"How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?"
"Much," said Marley's voice. No doubt about it.
"Who are you?"
"Ask me who I was."
"Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade."
"In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. You don't believe in me," observed the ghost.
"I don't,"
said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?"
"Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Humbug, I tell you, humbug."
At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a faint. Scrooge cowered in his chair and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "you believe in me or not?"
"I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?"
Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands.
"You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why."
"I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full and heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain, indeed.
Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob."
I have none to give, the ghost replied. It comes from elsewhere, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by others to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all that I can say. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our business, mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our office, and now weary journeys lie before me.
The ghost set up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the sound threatened to knock Scrooge from his chair.
"O captive, bound, and double-ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know that no amount of regret can make up for one's life's opportunities misused. Yet such was I, oh, such was I."
"But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself.
"Business?"
cried the ghost, wringing its hands again.
"Humanity was my business. The care of others was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business."
It held up its chain at arm's length, as if it were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again.
"At this time of year,"
the spectre said,
"I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raise them to see where my attention was needed most?"
Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly.
"Hear me!"
cried the ghost.
"My time is nearly gone."
"I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me."
How it is that I appear before you in a shape that you can see, I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day.
It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow.
"That is no light part of my penance,"
pursued the ghost.
"I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, Ebenezer."
"You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge.
"You will be haunted,"
resumed the ghost,
"by 3 spirits."
"Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice.
"It is."
I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge.
"Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1.
"Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge.
"Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us."
When it had said these words, the spectre gathered up its chains and wound them about itself again and walked backward from him. And at every step it took, the window raised itself a little.
so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer, and Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings, unexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity, and he looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some were linked together, none were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom he saw below on a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost that power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell, but they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he had walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable. And being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. I hope you've enjoyed this first installment of A Christmas Carol. A happy solstice, Merry Yule, Merry Christmas, and Happy Hanukkah to everyone. Thank you for spending some time with me today. If you've enjoyed your time, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. I'm Skaji. Safe journeys.